I'm going to introduce to you the TEI processing model. TEI processing model is a step towards declarative specification of the output of the TEI, and so I think it should be interesting in the context of this conference. My name is Peter Boot. As mentioned, I work at the Huygens Institute for the History and Culture of the Netherlands. What we do is, among other things, publication of historical material. And I've worked, for instance, on the letters of Vincent van Gogh, the Anne Frank manuscripts, and a number of other digital editions for which we use the TEI. So what are we going to do? I assume that most of you will have heard about the TEI, but I'm going to give a short introduction nevertheless. Then I'll talk about the TEI processing model. I'll talk briefly about its implementation in TEI Publisher, and I'll mention some of the extensions to the processing model that the people at TEI Publisher found necessary. And then I'm going to talk about a number of limitations that I've encountered in using the processing model, mostly when wanting to create nested outputs, and about the embedding of the processing model definitions in the TEI ODD schema definition. And then we'll get to some conclusions. So the text encoding initiative, it's a text set of more than 600 elements, mostly for humanities text. TEI is especially popular in libraries, for digital editions, for digital heritage text with publishers. One example of an organization which has decided to publish its resources in TEI is the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure Project, but it's just an example of from many others. The TEI is also a consortium with members, a board, and a technical council, and the technical council is responsible for the maintenance of the TEI schema or schemas and the guidelines. There's an online tool for schema definition. The TEI also contains its own schema specification language, and there's a tool set for schema generation. And those three are really important. Unlike many other XML vocabularies, TEI was conceived with the idea that it's really impossible to define a single text set for literally all of humanity's written heritage. So it's unavoidable that projects create their own modifications, extensions on the TEI guidelines. So each project or many projects need to define their own schema. So the creation of schemas has to be made really easy. And then there's also an Oxygen plugin for using TEI in an editor. But at least until some time ago, there was also always a problem in actually using TEI files. We try to convince people not to use Word or PDF to create their editions, but then when they have created their XML, how can they turn this into a web publication? Large institutions, of course, have processing staffs, but smaller projects or individuals could really be in a bind unless the encoder was willing to learn XSLT and HTML and CSS. And of course, some people may be willing, but it's difficult. It's really a different skill set. So that could be really a problem. And at the moment that Flanders and Hamlin wrote this was there were some tools that could help, but really very limited. And the arrival of the TEI processing model has really changed that completely. So what is the TEI processing model? It's born from the realization that every edition has different publication needs. That is, well, as I mentioned, there's an enormous amount of different types of documents. Research interests are constantly changing. Design preferences are changing. But that doesn't change the fact that most publications share a common set of building blocks, such as paragraphs and heads and lists and tables and what have you. So would it then be enough to create a mapping of TEI elements to HTML elements? You might think so, but no. First of all, we don't want to publish just on the web, just in HTML. We also want to publish in PDF, in plain text perhaps. And also we may want some components that are not available in plain HTML, such as numbered paragraphs, notes, pop-ups, etc. So what we need to do is to describe a set of abstract behaviors and then a flexible mapping of TEI elements to those abstract behaviors. And why must that mapping be flexible? Well, what is a label in your text may be a marginal note, or it may be treated like a heading. We may want some notes to be treated different from other notes. We may have a name element that we want to link to an authority file or not, etc. So there's really a need to set this up flexibly. The people who came up with this defined these 26 behaviors. I obviously don't have time to discuss all of them. Yes, you see, there are some of them which are really easily mappable to HTML, such as a paragraph and what have we, a table and table cells, list, etc. But also some items which are much more vague and it's not so clear what the behavior metadata exactly would have for an effect, or the behavior index. But this is certainly a good part of what you would want to do when publishing an edition. So how do we map TEI elements to these behaviors? Well, first of all, we have the model element. I mentioned TEI projects define their own schema, and in the ODD document, that's one document does it all. There's a schema specification element, and that schema specification element contains element specifications. And within the element specification, we define the content of the element, of obviously the description, attributes, where it's used. But there's also the model element, and what this model element do is to map the TEIP elements to the paragraph behavior. We can add some CSS classes for styling. There are other ways of doing CSS here, but we'll skip those. If you want multiple behaviors to be executed sequentially, we have the model sequence element. For instance, in this case, I've said I want an anchor element to be produced before the paragraph, or an anchor behavior to be executed, I should say. Maybe you have seen on the slide of the behaviors that many of these behaviors came with parameters. Of course, the behavior needs to be specified further in some cases. And for the anchor behavior, we have a parameter URL, which with a value attribute, which is interpreted as an XPath. So this is how the anchor gets its URL. Why is there no content parameter here for the paragraph behavior, you may ask? Well, that's implicit. By default, the content of the TEIP element will also be the content of the element that is, of the behavior that is being created. Then we may want to distinguish between various occurrences of this TEIP element. Some of them may need a different behavior than other occurrences. So in that case, we can use the predicate attribute. Predicate attribute again has an XPath expression as its value. So in this case, I've said that all the paragraphs in the TEI body will get a paragraph with number behavior, and all the other paragraphs, perhaps in the header, will have the default behavior. So the paragraph with number is a behavior that was not in the list of suggested values for the processing model. So this is something that I will have to take care, that I will have to somehow take care that it's implemented, even if the rest of the model is already implemented. Then finally, about the mapping, As I mentioned, it's not just web, it's also other environments. The model group element and the output attribute can be used in order to group model elements for a single output environment. And that output attribute, by the way, may also be used on individual model elements. So that's the mapping. And that's more or less in a very short overview, the processing model. So some things to understand. The processing model is by itself just a vocabulary. So the TEI doesn't offer working software that implements the processing model. And the list of behaviors is defined as suggested values. So it's possible for people to come up with other values, as we mentioned. This makes it a bit harder, of course, to implement the model because implementers will need some way to treat those new behaviors. As I mentioned, the TEI works on the assumption that everything that it does should be extensible and modifiable for special situations. I think that in the TEI processing model, you can distinguish three types of extensions. Changing the default processing model for certain elements, well, that's really ordinary. Say I want a certain type of list to be treated like a table, etc. So the next step would be to introduce new behaviors. And finally, the ultimate step would be to introduce, for instance, new attributes or elements to be able to describe new facets of the expected processing of our elements. Fortunately, at least one group has taken up the challenge of creating an implementation for the TEI processing model. That's the EI group, which is a foundation under German law that collects a number of projects, mostly in the German-speaking area, that have created, together with the people at XistDB, XML database, TEI Publisher. TEI Publisher processes the model elements and model sequence elements, etc., that we've just seen. It does so in the context of the XistDB XML database. So TEI Publisher is an XistDB app. It proposes a default ODD, so a set of processing definitions for most common TEI elements. And what a user can do is create his own ODD for the elements that should be treated differently. And then these two together can be compiled into working software. The user can create an app to handle his or her own XML with the ODD that he has created. And then some other things in TEI Publisher have to be done, for instance, creating panels, etc. And then you have your own application. And thanks to TEI Publisher, really, development for many projects has become much, much easier. TEI Publisher does a bit more. It also provides facilities for editing XML sources, but that's not what we are interested in at the moment. I'm checking time, I think time. What is interesting, I think, is to notice that at TEI Publisher, they have also found it necessary to extend the processing model in some ways. I mentioned a few of them. So they allow in the XPath attributes, such as predicate and value, they allow XQuery rather than just XPath. And that, of course, makes processing and computation possible that in XPath would be clumsy or perhaps impossible. It allows the use of external parameters in these XPath attributes, for instance, mode. So that makes it possible to make decisions based on the execution context rather than just on the XML environment of an element. It introduces user-defined behaviors, so there are they. A lot of TEI Publisher is built using web components, so custom HTML elements with behavior. And some of these web components can also be used as values for the behavior attribute. That's, for instance, a web component for activating a facsimile from another element. And one that I want to go a bit deeper into is that they allow templates within the model element. So suppose I have a list annotation element in my TEI which contains the notes to my text, and I want that list annotation to be turned into a section, but the section should have a header. The header should be just a literal notes. And that's something that's not provided out of the box in the TEI publishing model, processing model. TEI Publisher allows you then to use this template, which we see here. And within the template, we have parameterized HTML fragments. So we have heading, and the content heading parameter, which contains the literal notes, will go into the heading. And the content, so that's the content of the list annotation elements, will go after the heading. And then the processed templates will be provided with the behavior section. So that's very elegant. If you know a bit of HTML, you know immediately what's going on. On the other hand, it does break, of course, the abstract model of the TEI processing model. It is this wouldn't work if you want to use this definition in a PDF environment, for instance. And it also, well, as I say, it takes you out of the domain of the processing model into the domain of the target language. So these extensions on TEI on the processing model are, let's say, proprietary to TEI Publisher. They have not been ported back as yet into the TEI processing model specification. In a sense, it would be good if there were some exchange perhaps between the TEI Council and the people at TEI Publisher, because well, a new implementer now would have to think, well, is this a facility that I should also support? Is it in the standard or is it not? Now I'll get to the limitations that I wanted to discuss. What you see here is the print screen from the Mondrian edition that we recently published. It's an edition of the papers of Piet Mondrian, the Dutch painter. For me, it's a test case. I have set myself created a small project with the idea of I want to be able to describe the functionality of this edition in a purely declarative manner. And of course, for panel definitions, etc., that's not something that you do with the TEI processing model, but at least the processing within this edition, it should be possible to handle using the processing model. I've encountered some limitations, which I'm going to discuss. And the first limitation gets back to the example that I discussed for TEI Publisher templates, the list annotation with the literal heading and then the notes. So what we can do in TEI processing model, in a vanilla TEI processing model, so to speak, is to have a model sequence with a behavior heading and a behavior section. So this gives me the heading and the notes, but it doesn't give a single container in which these are embedded. So if I want to move the data around, for instance, using CSS, that's a bit of a problem. If I'm willing to introduce my own behavior, I could create within the paradigm of the TEI processing model a new behavior, say section with heading, and then there would be the parameters for the heading would also be here. And this would work. The disadvantage is that I would be dependent on someone implementing this behavior, of course. And the other disadvantage is that it leads to multiplication of different sorts of behavior, which really were already defined. This is not the only case where we need something like this. What to me seems the obvious solution is to allow nesting. So what I would think that would be a good idea is to have within the model behavior section the model sequence, and then the model sequence would contain first a model for the heading, and then model behavior block, and there the contents of the list annotation would go, so the notes would be there. Then I have both the heading and the notes, and also the section surrounding them. And there are many cases where something like this would be useful. Think, for instance, of the paragraphic number that we mentioned, would also be a good case for this. A page thumbnail that is also a link to a page, or a link that should be provided with a pop-up. These are all examples that would profit from being able to nest model elements. The next case that I want to discuss is ordering. At the moment in the TEI processing model, there are no facilities for grouping or sorting. Can only produce documents in output in document order, mostly. Of course, I can create a new behavior, like say I have a list of persons that I want to display in alphabetic order. I can say I define a behavior sorted block, and I use a parameter for the sort key. But say if I have multiple sort options, well, I could probably still do something using parameters, and then somehow wriggle multiple order parameters, multiple orders into the parameters. But I think the most clear and the most clean way of doing this would be to introduce a new element order, which can contain a name, and the name could then be used, for instance, as a label in a Dropbox, which could be used for the user to select the appropriate order, and then in the value there again would be a TEI XML expression pointing to the value to be used for the sorting. So that's one thing. And the last thing that I want to discuss is perhaps the most complicated, and perhaps would be also the most controversial. As I mentioned, we have in the current ODD structure schema specification, element specification, and model elements within the element specification. And this setup necessarily leads to the effect that all processing has to be defined at the element level. I think this is unfortunate for a number of reasons. Often the behavior of various elements is related, and that means that you have to define what's logically a single type of processing spread over various element definitions, also with the various context dependencies and processing dependencies in the expressed in the predicate elements. This can become quite complicated. It also has the effect that it is impossible to create something like reusable logic that you can call or execute from different contexts. So what I think would make much more sense is to remove the processing out of the schema specification. After all, it also has nothing to do with the schema. It's really different. And to introduce as a sibling to the schema specification element a schema proc, a schema processing element, which would be divided not on the basis of elements, but on the basis of, well, some sort of processing blocks. My idea is that you could argue about many of the details of this, that there might be one processing block with processing mode default, where we could define, let's say, the canonical behavior that we want to see for instance, the list person element or the person element. So that would be probably a list in the list item. But then you could also have other processing blocks, like a processing block pop-up or a processing block label. And in a case of the processing block pop-up, the model behavior for the person would be pop-up. So it would create a pop-up that could be used for that person in various contexts. And a label, for instance, for a person, we might need a label for a person to be able to display in a faceted search or in, well, in any other context. So in that case, we might have a processing block label, and the behavior might be just plain text. And the parameter would give the value like I go to the TEI first name of that person, and I take the full name. And so this would give us a number of, well, a way to create reusable functionality. And I think this would also be very useful if you want to create something like reusable components. So if I have an edition of, let's say, letters, I always have, let's say, auxiliary information that is in that edition, like persons or a bibliography or what have you, places, events. And when we could create something like this, and would also create a possibility to call or to execute from the letter template some functionality in the schema processing of the person schema, then I think we would begin to create something like reusable components that would really be very convenient, could really be very convenient in the creation of the editions. So I think the TEI processing model is a very useful facility. It has proven itself in many projects in the context of TEI Publisher. I think there's a need for some enhancements, but it's only logical in something that is really the first step in what is potentially a rich development towards declarative specification of edition. And I think the practical confrontation with the needs of an edition is what really helps you to encounter the limitations of this model. So if you're interested in what I'm doing on this, here is the address. If you go to gitlab-hack-knaw.nl, you can also just select the edition publication model. I want to thank you for your interest, and I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you very much, Peter, both. Okay, we have a very small amount of time, but maybe somebody has a question? Bieke on Zoom? Sid Bauman? Sid, if you can unmute yourself, and good morning.
Good morning. Uh-oh.
Hello, Sid.
Good morning. Thank you very much. This is absolutely a fantastic summary of the processing model and an excellent set of suggestions. Just there is supposedly some coordination between the council and TEI Publisher, and that Magdalena Turska is on both bodies, but there doesn't seem to have been much alignment yet. You're right. I'm a little distressed at that. But in any case, the thing I wanted to let you know is that your concern that your last suggestion was the most controversial, I think is backwards. I think that's the least controversial. When I had nothing to do with the development of the processing model, but when it was first presented to me, my first reaction out of the box was, I hate this. And it took me several minutes to realize that I didn't hate the idea at all. What I hated that it was inside the schema specification. It has to be separate. And so I think your last suggestion is spot on. I love it. I'm wondering though, how would it model the equivalent of a sequence that we currently have in the model sequence element? How would a model proc allow you to do that?
Well, I think in the same way as it is now. In my idea of, maybe I can share this again. Yes, you're seeing the sheet now, I think. So we have a processing block, and the processing block still contains element level things. So an element processing element which contains a model, but it might also contain a model sequence. So I think in that respect, I'm not proposing any changes.
Okay, I think, and model group, but now the difficulty is, do model groups go inside element procs, or do model groups group proc blocks?
Sid, I think you have to stop.